Hello, I'm Brian Smith. I research the evolution of business models and competitive strategies in pharma, medtech and other biomedical industries. Today's masterclass is one of a series, and recordings of all the masterclasses can be found on my YouTube channel. There are also supporting articles for many of the classes, and if you'd like PDFs of those, then please get in touch. This and most of the other masterclasses are based on my book, Brand Therapy, which was my 6th book, and that describes a comprehensive and integrated set of techniques for developing strong strategies in medical markets. Brand Therapy obviously is available on Amazon and all other bookshops. And my goal today is to help you understand the opportunities and threats from your competitive environment, because of course doing that is one of the essential steps in making strong strategy. So these are the questions that I'm going to cover today. This is my agenda for today. So you may think you know the answers to these questions already, but when in practice I do this with pharma and medtech companies, the answers always surprise the executives I'm working with, and they help to reshape the way that they think about competition. So I hope I'm going to achieve that with you today. So let's start with what I mean by competitors. If you work in an operational role, then you think about operational competitors. That is, those companies that can win market share at your expense. They threaten the achievement of your operational goals. But if you're in a strategic role, you're responsible for strategy, then you need to think about your strategic competitors, which means anybody that can either stop you achieving your strategic goals, such as return on investment, or reduce the probability that you will achieve your strategic goals. So today I'm focusing on strategic competitors and the strategic competitive environment, which includes but is not limited to operational competitors. So there, very quickly, we've answered our first question. If you're responsible for strategy, then your competitive environment is anything that might stop or reduce the probability of you achieving your strategic goals, which in our industry is usually your risk-adjusted return on investment. And that answer, of course, which isn't what most people think of when they talk about competition, changes how you look at the next 4 questions. The strategic competitive environment is an unstable dynamic equilibrium between 2 opposing forces. On the one hand, innovation, on the other hand, imitation. And these 2 forces push up against each other all of the time. The balance between them is dictated by the market environment, in particular by the sociological environment and the technological environment. Some market environments favour innovation and they limit innovation. By contrast, some environments favour imitation and limit innovation. So the balance is constantly shifting. It's dynamic. So, for example, when the science is not making any new breakthroughs and the economics is not allowing new demand to emerge, then innovation is disfavoured. By contrast, when the environment encourages economies of scale, it encourages IP erosion, it encourages experience curves which reduce costs, and existing demand is growing, then imitation is favoured. In the same way, when capital is cheap, IP protection is strong, new scientific discoveries are coming along, and there's a high unmet need, then innovation is favoured. And when there are high barriers to entry and markets are commoditized, then imitation is disfavoured. So there is the answer to the second question. The competitive environment is shaped by the balance between imitative and innovative behaviours in the marketplace. And that balance, a constantly shifting dynamic, is driven by many factors in the market environment, especially sociological and technological factors. Now, forgive me if this sounds a little bit theoretical, a little bit abstract to you, but it's important because just like by understanding the basics of biology, we can predict clinical outcomes, then by understanding the science of the competitive environment, we can anticipate competitive outcomes. Incidentally, if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to look at another one of my masterclass recordings, the one about anticipating the market, because that is has a lot of content in about how to make sense of these sociological and technological environments. So that takes us on to our third question. Where will the competition come from? Which direction should we be looking in for competitive pressure? The answer to that lies in system science. Now, you may think you haven't heard of system science, but you have, because you've all heard the phrase a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop, where a system reinforces positive or negative trends, pushing the system one way or another. But there is a third kind of loop in systems theory called a balancing loop, in which the system has forces pushing in opposite directions and balances itself out. And that's what happens with imitation and innovation. They create what systems thinkers call a balancing causal loop, because innovation encourages imitation and imitation encourages innovation. When that happens, instead of the market system moving in one direction or another, it goes in cycles as the two forces reinforce and counter each other. That cycling activity creates what we call the product category life cycle. To be absolutely clear, what I'm not talking about here is the life cycle of a single product or a single brand. I'm talking about the life cycle of a product category, like statins or a product category, or vascular stents or a product category. There are 4 stages in the product category life cycle, and although the diagram shows them as distinct phases, in reality they blur into each other. The cycle begins with the entry of a new product category. This is then adopted by innovative customers. It disrupts market behaviour and leads to a change in market behaviour from using the old technology to the new technology. This is followed by the growth of that new category. When it grows, it encourages imitators to launch new versions of the new category, and all of that market activity grows the market even further, and it leads to gradual replacement of the old product category by the new product category. That leads you into the 4th phase of consolidation and convergence, where the market converges on similar designs of the new technological category, and then the market consolidates down to a few players, usually making very similar products and competing very intensely. Then finally, at the end of this cycle, the obsolescence and retreat phase, the new product category that was itself becomes obsolescent and retreats in the face of an emerging new technology. This product category life cycle is more than just theory. It's important to the understanding of the competitive environment, because the direction of strategic competition changes over the course of the life cycle. The competition you face, strategically speaking, varies depending on which one of these 4 phases you're in. So, for example, at the disruption and transition phase, the biggest threats to ROI are the incumbents companies with the old product category. But we also see limits on critical inputs that limit our return on investment. So, for example, there's a shortage of skilled people in immuno-oncology right now. There aren't enough of them, and they are expensive and hard to find. Another example is the availability of effective and credible trial centres or novel medical technologies. These critical inputs can limit the achievement of your strategic goals. That means that although you might not traditionally have thought of them as competitors, they are part of your strategic competitive environment, because they'll limit the probability of you achieving your return on investment. At the second phase, growth establishment, the incumbent technology is lessening, but the market growth encourages new entrants with imitators. At the same time, growth makes those critical inputs even more difficult to obtain, because there are more people wanting them. And towards the end of this stage, the payers start to pay an interest in driving down the cost of the new technology, because it's becoming dominant. All 3 of those forces, again, are strategic competitors, even though you don't think of them as that, because they limit your ROI, and therefore it would be a strategic mistake to ignore them. As markets mature, the old technology starts to become irrelevant, but now those imitators with the newer technology consolidate to a few large players who compete intensely. And this competition, of course, is encouraged by players with mechanisms like contracts and tenders. It's often at this stage that indirect competitors come in, for example, talking therapies in mental health markets, or alternative clinical techniques in medical devices. Again, all of these changes threaten your ability to achieve your risk-adjusted return on investment, so they are strategic competitors, even though you probably wouldn't have written them down in your list of competitors. Towards the end of the life cycle, the market commoditizes and peer pressure becomes its most intense. And as a new cycle begins, a new technology starts to emerge and compete with you. So again, it doesn't matter that you don't think of them as competitors, they are strategic competitors. So now we can answer our third question. Because our strategic competition is anyone who threatens our ROI, and because the competitive environment is shaped by the social and technological environments, we see a balancing causal loop, which results in a product category life cycle, and the sources of strategic competition depend on where you are in that life cycle. So now we're left with those two questions. How do different strategic competitors compete with us, and what can we do about it? There's an important concept to grasp, and this the idea of the profit pool. The profit pool is simply the total amount of profit available to everyone involved in the market. What strategic competitors have in common is that they all want to drink from the same profit pool as you do. So generally their success comes at the expense of your ROI. So just because they don't look like you or make the same sorts of products as you, it doesn't mean they're not strategic competitors. They drink from the same profit pool as you, but in different ways. How they drink from that profit pool varies according to their strengths and their capabilities. Incumbents have inertia on their side, scale, quite often experience. Critical suppliers quite often have a monopoly or an oligopoly type position. Imitators can point to the similarities with you because it reduces switching costs, for instance, but they point to small differences of advantage too. Substitute products quite often use their differences and point to the novelty of their approach. Peers use their scale and their comparison between similar products to trade people off against each other. So of course, that means that incumbents will typically try to fence in a new product category into a niche, and they might use intellectual property to do that, or pricing tactics, or play up the limitations of the new product. Critical suppliers will try to use their position to make you pay as much as possible, and when they've fully exploited that route, they'll limit your growth because they want to constrain supply, because it suits them, it allows them to skim prices. The usual route for imitators in our market is not to set up from scratch, but to acquire the third or fourth or fifth place player and then invest into them. Either they acquire the product or acquire the company, okay, and then bundle it into their product portfolio and add added value services to differentiate what is essentially a Me Too product. Substitutes in our markets tend to try and make a virtue out of not being you. Okay, they target market segments that seek novelty, and they often go through different channels and different budgets, as per the example of talking therapies. And when peers, of course, they always want to pay much less for much more. They'll try to drive down prices, they'll demand discounts, they'll demand more service, or all of those things together. If they're powerful enough, they'll be able to do all of those things at once. The important point to grasp here is that each type of strategic competitor causes you different problems, and therefore you have to respond or preempt in a different way. And since the most important strategic competitor at any one time depends on where you are in the life cycle, the product category life cycle, so your competitive response has to vary across the course of the life cycle. So now we're in a position to answer that fourth question. We know that the direction of strategic competition will change over the course of the life cycle. And we know that different strategic competitors will compete in different ways based on their strengths. So we can anticipate how threats to our strategic goals are going to change. And that allows us to proactively address the competitive threats rather than simply wait for them to happen and then react. All of this underlying science allows us to move on to this last question: how do we preempt those competitive forces? And what that science tells us is that there's effectively a 6-stage systematic approach to anticipating and then preempting strategic competitive activity. These 6 stages shown in the slide. Drilling down into them, the first stage is that it begins with looking for the signs that tell you where you are in your product category life cycle, looking for biomarkers, if you like. You can't do this instead by simply asking how many years the product category has been around, because life cycles are sometimes only a few months and sometimes many decades. But by looking at these biomarkers, things like growth rates, numbers of players in the market, the variation between products and so on, you can generally identify with a fair degree of accuracy which life cycle stage you're in, and or whether you're in one of the transition steps. Knowing that allows you to know how your strategic competitors are going to be now and in the immediate future. And if you know your market with any degree of integrity, then you can usually predict who exactly those competitors are going to be from each direction. Knowing where your competition is coming from and who they are allows you to anticipate broadly, at least, what sort of competitive tactics will be used. Because, as we discussed, your competitors will use their capabilities. And this allows you to get pretty specific about what competitive pressures you'll be under, what your competitive scenario will look like. That leads to a list of potential putative threats and opportunities from the competitive environment, and these can be validated in the next stage, which I'll mention in a moment. Knowing what your validated competitive threats and opportunities are allows you to develop countermeasures in advance. And this is important because usually strong countermeasures to competitive activity require you to develop some new capabilities that you may not have. It's important to stress that, because what I usually say in my research is that the large part of the reason why companies fail to counter competitive threats is because they haven't anticipated them, and having not anticipated them, they haven't developed the capabilities to counter them. So, for example, many companies are working and don't have the capabilities to do contextual segmentation and to target segments correctly with segment-specific extended value propositions. All of those capabilities will be needed if you were in a mature market fighting direct imitators and strong peer pressure, for example. I need to say a word or two about those reality filters that I talked about. Right? I talked about CLAL and USO, which are simply acronyms. In short, CLAL is an acronym for testing and validating opportunities. An opportunity is not an opportunity unless it's complementary to, or at least not conflicting with, existing opportunities, unless it is large enough to be worth exploiting, unless it's commercially accessible to the company, and unless it lasts long enough to be exploited. A potential or putative opportunity that you see from the competitive environment must pass all 4 of these tests to be a valid opportunity that you need to worry about. In the same way, a threat is not a threat unless it's unmitigated by other factors, unless it is significantly forceful to impact on the business, if it's not defended against by competitive activity, and it's not a threat if it doesn't last long enough to be a problem. Again, a putative threat must pass all 4 of these tests to become a validated threat. And these tests, known as reality filters, probably deserve a long explanation that I'm giving them today, but I am going to cover them in more detail in the SWOT alignment masterclass. The important point to grasp is that not every putative opportunity and threat translates into a validated opportunity or threat. And it's only the validated opportunities and threats validated by these tests that are strategically significant enough for you to worry about preparing for and preempting. Those validated opportunities guide you to what you might do to mitigate them or to exploit the competitive opportunities. So, for example, you can head off imitate us with contextual segmentation. Okay? One can exploit market commoditization by creating extended value propositions. Obviously, the detail of how you anticipate and preempt competition is very case specific, and there isn't time to cover it here. The important point is that by anticipating the competition and validating the threats, it makes it possible to know what they're going to be in advance and allows you to preempt them, as in this slide here. So there's the answer to the final question. We preempt the competition by identifying and validating the competitive environment and using those opportunities and threats to guide proactive competitive activities. So I'm going to close now and summarize. And to do that, I want to contrast typical practice in our industry with what I see as best practice in our industry. There are 6 major differences, I think, between typical and best practice. Best practice tends to look beyond the present, beyond operational competitors to strategic competitors. Best practice tends to look beyond the present to the future. Best practice tends to look beyond product-oriented competition towards a range of competitive activity. Best practice tends to look at opportunities as well as threats. Best practice tends to concentrate on validation of those threats, and typical practice does not. Best practice tends to not just have generalized reaction to any sort of competition, but tends to seek for specific pro-action and not reaction. And if you look at the slide and if you're honest with yourself and say that you think your strategic responses are more to the left rather than to the right, well, that's good news, because it means there's an opportunity for you and your marketing team to find ways to improve the probability of achieving risk-adjusted return on investment, which is the best way a marketing team can maximize value in the company. So I'm going to close there, and that's as much as I want to say today. If you'd like to know more about how to apply these in detail, in particular in your company, then please contact me. I'll arrange a separate call, and I'll be glad to talk more detail with you than I can in a broad masterclass like this. If you enjoyed the masterclass, then by all means mention it on LinkedIn or Twitter. That would be useful. Thank you very much for your interest in the work. You can read much more detail in the 7 books I've written about our industry so far, and I hope very much that I'll see you at one of my future masterclasses. Thank you very much.